The storm came like a verdict, sudden, precise, as if the sky itself had decided that the town of Hallowmere had been allowed too much daylight for too long. Wind tore at the hedgerows, turned the lane into a river of wet leaves, and set the gutters singing a thin, anxious song. Beyond the last lamplight, the old forest loomed like a memory. A silhouette of bare branches and secret hollows the villagers pointed at with knuckles and superstition. They said the wood remembered old bargains. They said the stones under its roots held grudges. Mara Ellis had always believed those things in the practical way of small-town people. Keep to the path, don't take what isn't offered, lock your doors. But belief softened into resignation since the losses had come. A mother who did not wake, a father whose cough became an empty house, and a brother who left one winter night and never came home. Grief leveled the world into the narrow corridor of chores and small mercies. It made the nights longer and the pennies thinner. It taught her to measure danger like everything else, by what it cost to ignore it. Her cottage crouched at the fringe of that corridor, where the road narrowed to a single lane, and the fog liked to settle like a shawl over the thatch. The windows were small, the hearth stubborn, and the garden had given up trying to be anything but a patch of determined weeds. Neighbors passed with polite nods and pity in their eyes. Children ran the other way when she walked the path to the well. She had grown used to the solitude. Solitude was an animal she fed with steady hands. Mending clothes in the afternoons, sweeping the ashes into neat, gray piles, putting a pot of barley to soak because food made things bearable. She liked the way the kettle whistled in the kitchen, a human sound in a house that contained memories shaped like hollow spaces. On that night, the storm came with teeth. Rain hammered the roof as if to unnerve whatever lay sleeping below it. The lanterns guttered in the lane, and the town felt smaller than usual, the world reduced to the beat of water on panes. Mara had wrapped herself in a wool shawl despite the heat of the fire, because grief had a way of making the air thinner. She had not expected visitors. The last knock at her door had been 3 months ago, a man asking for work he could not do. She did not mean to answer when thunder tightened its fist near the horizon, but something, a sound, a movement by the gate, made her rise. There was a figure at the threshold, half bent and half collapsed, a dark shape that the lantern's feeble light could not fully arrest. He wore rags made of good cloth, torn and mudded, as if someone with care had tried to keep a dignity he no longer possessed. When Mara opened the door, the figure slumped like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Rain clung to his hair. His face, when she leaned closer, was ashen as though washed in moonlight. He breathed, shallow and quick, and his fingers, long, with nails not yet bitten down, twitched on the doorframe. "Please," he said, and the word was a small, weary thing that carried more need than the poor bodies in the market with their hands out for bread. Mara's hands had learned to ignore the tremor that came with handling the world's small emergencies. She moved with the familiar efficiency of someone who had had no other option. She hunted for a blanket without letting him see the way her throat had closed. Come in, or you'll drown." He did not protest. He came inside with the strange lightness of someone who had already traveled where roads did not go. She guided him to the straw mattress by the hearth, set a bowl of warm water at his lips, and pressed a cloth to a darkening tear on his temple. He tasted of iron and rain and something faintly sweet beneath it, like the memory of old wine. His skin was cold, colder than any fever should make a body, as if the warmth that lived inside him had receded to places she could not touch. "Who are you?" she asked once, in the safety of the room's lamplight. Her voice sounded smaller than she intended. He turned his head, and his eyes caught hers like a pair of coins struck from a strange mint. They were silver, not gray, a liquid metal that reflected the flames in the hearth with a light that seemed to come from nowhere. In their depths there was a shimmer, a thread of crimson that flared and fell the way a heartbeat might flicker in a deep chest. For a moment Mara felt as if someone had prodded at a fresh bruise. The world leaned in, curious and frightened. "My name is," he stopped. The syllables hovered like a moth over a candle. When he spoke again, his voice was older than his face, patient and threaded with a softness that did not belong to his state. Valen. It should have been the strangest thing. A man with the kind of eyes that made priests and cattle alike uneasy, given a name like a hymn. Mara's fingers, the ones that had tied bandages and folded hems 100 times, trembled with the unfamiliar ache of wanting to know. "How did you get here?" He smiled, and it was a fissure of moonlight in the dark. "The road takes what it will," he said, and the words could have been a confession or a story learned at another's hearth. "I was found." There were questions gnawing at her back, why he'd been bleeding on the lane, why the villagers hadn't finished him when they saw him, why his voice held no hint of the poor. But other people's fear arrived in the shape of half-conscious advice. Don't keep strangers. Don't take what's offered by the forest. Don't invite trouble in out of pity. Mara listened to the memory of that caution like she had once listened to her mother's voice when it had been living, and then put it away. Grief had taught her that cowardice and kindness shared a narrow border. The map between them was a vanishing path. She set herself to work with the practical tools of mercy. She warmed broth and fed it to him with a wooden spoon, coaxing the stiff fingers to close around it. She cleaned the wound on his temple with the gentleness of someone who has loved someone else's pain until it becomes familiar. He flinched when she bandaged the cut, not from pain but from something else, as if touch carried the weight of old promises. "You should not have done this," he said suddenly, voice rough with unused honesty. "You should lock your door and not look out." "Someone had to," she replied, because there was no ceremony in kindness, only the small, stubborn insistence of a life. The cottage smelled of peat and the lemon soap she used. Rain drummed the world into a single note. She looked at him then, really looked. The curve of his jaw like a grave statue, the hollows beneath his cheekbones that spoke of nights without sleep, the faint lines around an eye that suggested he had smiled at someone once and survived it. She thought of the stories the villagers told. A king turned monster, a pact broken with the old ones. She thought, too, of the collection of small memories she kept like coins, a boy's laugh in the yard, the sound of her mother's humming, and how the house felt too large for one woman to keep polished against the dark. "Rest," she said at last. "I'll get a blanket." He watched her move with a curious intensity, as if memorizing the pattern of her hands. When she left the room, the lamplight caught the silver of his eyes and set the faint crimson like an ember that resisted the wind. Mara closed the door against the storm, and for a moment imagined that the village itself drew a breath out of relief, and perhaps a little fear. She could not know the history that followed him like shadow, nor the crowns he had set down like stones along the road. She could not know that there were hunters who remembered the shape of his rule, and that wherever he rested the old world tilted. All she knew was that, in a house that smelled of barley and old wool, a wounded stranger slept with the heavy sleep of someone who might not wake tomorrow. She sat by the fire with hands that did not stop, mending a sleeve, tucking the future into neat, hopeful folds. Outside, the storm kept its counsel. Inside, the lamplight burned steady and human. And in the thin spaces between one breath and the next, two lives that had once been separate began, without ceremony, to notice one another. For 3 nights Mara waited for the fever to break like a hard winter breaking into thaw. She rose with the dawn and checked the stranger's pulse with the same mechanical devotion. She measured the kettle's boil and the clockwork of the world. At first his breathing was ragged and shallow. His wounds, bruised temple, a long, crude cut along his forearm, looked angry and raw beneath the linen. Mara dressed them with the oil she kept for her hands and wrapped the arm in strips of clean cloth. Each hour she returned with broth, with questions she did not ask aloud, with the ritual comforts of a life that refused to be swallowed by sorrow. On the second morning, she found the bandages dry where they should have been damp. Where she had expected scab and slow, stubborn healing, there were smooth, pale edges. Where a bruise had blackened, skin bloomed back the way things do in a garden startled into color. She put her fingers to the cut and felt warmth that was not her own, like a pulse running beneath cloth. She sat very still and watched him breathe. The fine hair on his arms lay flat as if pressed by a tide she could not see. At noon, the candles guttered and died in the corners of the room, not for lack of wax, but as if something had taken the flame by a polite, invisible hand. Shadows moved low and long across the floorboards, shapes that pooled, stretched, then broke as if some other geometry governed them. The wind found its way through the smallest seams and seemed to speak in syllables Mara knew. her name, threaded in the breath that sifted through the eaves. Once she heard it clearly, whispered against the back of her neck, so intimate it had the warmth of a confession. Mara, fear rose like bile. The stories of the forest, of bargains and old blood, rang against her skull like a bell. She thought of her mother's voice, the one that used to tell the children not to wander near the hedgerows at dusk. But terror was a convenient thing. One could put it away like an ill-fitting dress. She had a stranger to care for and a bowl of stew cooling on the table. Practicality held the room together. That night she woke to a sound so small she might have imagined it, a rustling at the window, as if a creature had forgotten what belonged outside. Mara padded to the sill and peered out. By the low wash of moonlight, a crow hunched on the stone wall, one wing folded at an awkward angle, feathers matted with blood. The bird's beak opened in a useless caw and then closed again, an animal plea. Valen was already up. He moved with a silence that belonged to shadows, stepping out into the night as if the chill only belonged to the world and not to him. She followed, robe thrown over her shoulders, because human curiosity is a poor successor to dread. The yard smelled of wet earth and peat. The rain had ceased to declaim and now only murmured. He crouched where the crow shivered, hand hovering above the small body. For a single heartbeat, Mara felt the old folk tales tighten their hold on her. Vampires, revenants, kings who took what they wanted without asking. But what she saw was not the monstrous theater of myth. Valen's fingers, when they touched the bird, did so with a tenderness that made her stomach lurch. The crow's chest rose beneath his touch like the chest of a newborn. She watched him lean forward, and she did not know what to call it, a bite, a press of lips, a movement so deft it was almost reverent. The crow did not struggle. Valen's jaw worked for a second and then stopped. He drew back, and the little bird breathed once, cooed, and then stilled, its wing uncurling as if given back to its shape. Valen's hands trembled. Shame made a dark thing under his skin. He glanced at her, and the silver of his eyes clouded like storm glass. I'm sorry, he said, voice small and brittle. I did not mean. For a moment, Mara wanted to step back in a fear older than herself. Instead, she stepped forward. It saved it, she asked, because it was all she could think to say. Caution and compassion braided together at the throat. He shook his head, the movement slow with an exhaustion that seemed to take shape on his bones. I do not feed as you might think, he said. Not often. Never from those who would scream to the skies if they knew. There was a bare, almost childish apology in the way he touched the crow's feathers, as if the bird had been wronged simply by being necessary. You should not, she began. But words failed at the doorway between human law and whatever rules governed him. Instead, she cupped the bird instinctively, feeling the faint warmth under its feathers, and then saw that Valen's hands had left a shimmer, no more than a breath, on the animal, the sort of small miracle that knits what was torn. He rose to his full height then, and the moon drew a halo at his shoulders. You must go, he said softly, and the words were not a request. You must put distance between yourself and me, Mara. You are too kind for a world like mine. Kindness, in his mouth, sounded like a fragile relic. The sentence carried 1,000 doors, warning, plea, and command all braided together. He tried to make his face look as if he meant it, as if he could step away and not look back. Mara watched the breath fog in the air between them and felt something like anger at his assumption that her heart belonged to fear alone. Why, she demanded, not from defiance, but because honesty had become the only currency she trusted. Why would I leave someone who needs help, even you? Her voice crackled. Even if you are what everyone says, I'm not the village. I won't turn away. Valen's expression broke then, the veneer of command crumbling to reveal a fissured sorrow. He looked older than grief, as if he carried his past like a shawl. Once, he began, and the word hung like an offering, I ruled a kingdom where dusk and dawn stood in a careful balance. My people were bound to me by law and blood. I tried to change what had been taken for granted. I was soft, too soft for the kind of rule they expected. My compassion cost me a crown. He swallowed, and for the first time in the cottage's history, Mara heard the echo of a man who had been used to being obeyed. They called me traitor. They called me weak. In the end, what I loved made me vulnerable. He did not elaborate, and she did not press for more. It is difficult to interrogate a wound while someone is bleeding. Instead, she reached out, and for a brief suspended moment, a hand hovered over his, then rested. The touch was not theatrical. It was an agreement written in the small print of ordinary life. "If your world will not have you," she said quietly, "then come into mine for as long as you must. I will not stand at the gate and decide whose life is worth sheltering." He closed his eyes at that, and for once, did not move away. The wind stitched their names together, and somewhere beyond the hedgerows, an owl declared the night as if it were free to. In the small house warmed by barley broth and stubborn light, they had made a fragile truce. He would not ask her to be brave, and she would not pretend not to be. Outside, the forest kept its counsel, and the moon arranged itself like an audience for what might come next. The dreams began as small intrusions, a shard of a throne, the echo of a footstep in a hall too wide to be real, and then spread like spilled ink across Mara's nights. She would wake with the taste of iron in her mouth and the memory of voices chanting in a language that had no name in the town. Sometimes she arose with her palms pressed to her chest, as if to be sure her heart still belonged to the life she knew. Damp linen, barley porridge, the small coin of ordinary worry. Other times, she lay very still and listened to the silence he made in the room beside hers, and wondered how much of his past had become a map inside her own skull. Valen slept like someone who had practiced sleep as a skill, half open, half shut, one hand always curled near the place where the hearth's light pooled. When he spoke in his sleep, it was rarely the clipped, foreign syllables of an unknown tongue. It was the soft name of a person who once mattered enough to populate his quiet. Mara rose night after night to find him tracing a keep with a fingertip through the ash on the hearthstone, as if the motion kept something at bay. Sometimes when she pressed her hand to his shoulder, warmth answered in a hollow place beneath the skin. It was a warmth she would not have expected from a stranger who should have been colder than the moon. It felt like a small, illicit truth. By the third week, the town had noticed. Hallowmere ran on rumor as much as it ran on river water and gossip, and both were plentiful. At the market, people bent conversations around her name and lowered their voices when she passed. A child dropped his loaf in the dirt and fled. A shopkeeper crossed himself at her approach. The priest, Father Alden, a man who had once been a stubborn advocate for mercy in good times, now looked at Mara with a softness that had hardened into caution. "You bring danger into your house," he warned one afternoon on the lane, hands folded as if in a prayer that had been interrupted. The church bell clanged like an accusation behind him. "The old tailies are bones for a reason. They keep teeth where they belong." Mara felt the urge to answer with the list of ordinary things. How the world had already taken so much from her, that kindness felt like the only coin she could spend without losing herself. Instead, she said simply, "He's hurt, Father." "He is not the hurt," Father Alden said. "He is the contagion. You must not shelter what you do not understand." His eyes lingered on the horizon where the forest made a dark teeth line against the sky. "They were guardians once," he added reluctantly, "but the old ways turn men to myth and myths to monsters if we let them." Valen came upon them without his usual noiselessness. The old man's voice had carried, and his shadow cut the road like a blade. He did not speak to Father Alden. He offered only a bow that was almost ritual, and then turned his face to the clouds. Mara saw the priest's jaw tighten, as if remembering some scripture he had once been taught in training, and never unlearned. It was an odd thing to watch. They were two men who had once stood in different parts of the world, and now hesitated like actors on a small, uncertain stage. That night, Mara found him waiting for her on the threshold of the ruined garden, hands folded in a way she had seen kings take counsel. Moonlight feathered the lines of his face and gave him the look of an old fresco come to life. "They will not like it," he said softly. "You are not safe from their fear." "Neither are you," Mara said. "You say your kind were guardians. But if you were guardians, why did they hunt you?" She asked the question not out of accusation so much as the human insistence to understand the why behind suffering. Valen's eyes went to the hedgerow where the town's lights made a dim constellation. He had said fragments before, hints tossed like bones into a starving room. But tonight he gave her more, not in the form of a lecture but like a confession laid across his palms. We were bound to the balance between life and death, he said. Our law was to shepherd souls, to keep the toll fair. We held the thin places together. But humanity's appetite is a kind of hunger that can make laws seem cruel. Men came asking for endlessness, for power, and some of my own began to believe that preserving their own lives demanded they take more than a contract allowed. They began to feed without the old rights. They turned necessity into appetite. My mercy, he paused, and the knight had the patience to wait as he chose the word with care, was interpreted as weakness. I argued for restraint when others wanted dominion. It cost me my crown. Mara had a picture of a ruler who had been more beloved than feared. She had a different picture than the one the village had fed on, no throne of malice, but a man who had thought the world did not have to be brutal. And so they hunted you, she asked. They hunted what they feared I might not punish, Valen said. They feared what my mercy might entail, the redistribution of power to those who had none. So they rallied around dread. They made laws in the name of survival. They burned what they could not understand. He turned to her then, and for a moment she had the disconcerting sense of standing at the edge of a continent and seeing the waves of history crash and break against the cliff. His loneliness, she realized, was not merely the absence of company, but the weight of being blamed for compassion. Their days settled into a strange domesticity, dawn with its modest chores, afternoon with the quiet exchange of knowledge. Mara read to him as the evenings lengthened, old romances she had kept from her mother's chest, seamstresses' manuals, town records yellowed at the edges. She watched as his fingers traced lines of ink he could not read in any modern hand, and she felt a peculiar tenderness. In return, he taught her scraps of language that made her tongue feel clumsy, and told her myths that did not belong on any parish shelf. Of the bridges where debt was paid, of the river that once sang to souls passing between worlds, of ceremonies that tied the dead to memory rather than chaining them to hunger. One night, as autumn gathered its cloak about the hedgerows and the moon rose full and swollen, they sat on the low wall that edged the ruined garden. Above them, the world was a dish of softened silver. Valen had taken to speaking in the old manner when they were alone, using words like hold fast and toll as if the language itself were a talisman. Mara listened, feeling the slow stitch of belonging in the quiet. You say your heart no longer beats, she said finally, testing a truth she had half feared and half hoped. How can you feel? He turned his face to her, and for once the usual reserve dropped like a curtain. My chest is a room without a hearth, he said. There is a hollow where a heart used to be. There are rhythms I can mimic, breath, warmth. But the thing that kept a heart honest went out of me some years ago. It is not simply pulse I miss. It is the small betrayals and small mercies, the petty irritations of having to be human and nothing else. Mara's hand found his, not by premeditation but by something simpler. The need to confirm that the world still allowed such contact. When her fingers closed, a tremor of sensation flared through him like the echo of a bell. He inhaled sharply, and the motion felt as if a stray current had been rooted into a broken line. For a long moment his eyes, those silver coins streaked with crimson, held a bright, liquid surprise. That was not nothing, he murmured. There was wonder in the admission and the sort of fear that lives beside wonder. When you touch me, I remember warmth. For an instant, the hollow answers. They did not mistake the sensation for the miraculous cure she secretly hoped it might be. They both knew superstition like a second language. Still, there was an intimacy in acknowledging fragility. The confession unspooled into quiet laughter that had no need for embarrassment, and then into silence that felt less like a void and more like a shared field. The blood moon came a week later, an omen in the sky that made even the stoic tavern-goers mutter under their breath. On that night, the world seemed to tilt on a different axis. Shadows lengthened and took on a slow, almost voluptuous life. They stood together in the garden, eyes lifted to the heaven that bled red into the rim of the world. Mara felt something like an ache press behind her ribs, part longing, part grief for what she could not yet name. Valen reached for her, then with a handsomeness that had nothing to do with courtly grace and everything to do with raw need. Their palms met, fingers threaded, and for a long, suspended heartbeat, the the universe reduced to the two of them and the moon's crimson. There was no carnal heat that night, no fevered abandon. What passed between them was a quieter thing, an aching that felt like the recognition of an old debt paid forward. Their faces were close, and Mara could smell rain and peat and something far older, sandalwood, or incense burned in a hall with stone columns. "I do not want to hurt you," he said, so softly she might have imagined the words. "My hunger, there are times it is not a thing I can command. And there are times I will stand with you anyway," she replied. Her voice steadied on the night air as if she had carved a small bridge for them to meet on. For a brief span, they let the world be nothing more than two bodies and the sky. Then the sky answered with a warning. Valen's features tightened. His fingers, which had been steady, curled as if grasping an invisible rail. The silver of his eyes flared into something molten and red like flames seen through glass. Mara felt the small magnetism of fear, an instinctive recoil. She put her palm to his chest and felt the echo of their earlier touch go cold as the hollow made itself known again. Only this time it was accompanied by raggedness, as if the season of the bones were upon him. The curse that lay under quiet moments stirred, and the night, always an accomplice to their small rebellions, seemed to hold its breath. Valen swallowed, and in the motion, something old and terrible uncurled in him. "I am not steady," he said with blunt honesty. "When the moon calls like that, the tether frays. I will not ask you to stand in that storm without understanding what it could take." Mara's heart beat a slow, stubborn rhythm. "I know," she said, "and I choose to stay." The words fell into the space between them with the gravity of a promise more than of bravery. Outside, the hedgerow made a low, insect sound as if applauding the small act of courage. Inside, two lives that had been strangers only a month before learned what it felt like to keep watch together as shadows moved and old hunger stirred in the dark. Rumor is a small, fast animal, something that eats and multiplies and keeps moving until it has filled every empty corner. In Hallowmere, it found food in the shape of a story. The beggar at Mara Ellis's door, the silver eyes that watched the hearth, the strange lights in the hedgerow. Traders from the next market spoke of a shadow scene on the hill. A shepherd swore he had found a scent of iron along the lane. From those simple seeds, the Order of the Crimson Dawn, men and women wrapped in scarlet sashes and older oaths, fanned out like a net. They rode in at twilight with banners, so knew they still smelled faintly of dye. Their leader was an ex-soldier called Captain Rourke, a man with a jaw like a drawn blade and a face that knew how to hold a tribunal in a quiet room. He carried with him relics that sang of practical faith, bolts tipped with silver, crosses hammered from iron blessed by a priest who prayed with his eyes open. The order had not come for bandits or for petty thieves. They came because they had a memory and an oath, and both were old enough to be poisonous. Mara realized their intent before she saw the banners. Children ran home from the lane with their mothers' skirts clutched in their fists. The innkeeper bolted his door and placed a tankard of ale in the window as a signal, warning. Valen stood at the cottage's low wall with his hands folded, as if the arrival of soldiers were a minor inconvenience and not the closing of a gate. They demanded he be handed over. Rourke's voice carried. Beneath the official words was a raw hunger. "By the statutes of the order," he proclaimed, "we reclaim what is a threat to the living. You will surrender yourself, or we will take action." Mara stepped between the soldiers and the man she had sheltered. The thought that rose like heat behind her ribs was not courage so much as the urgent, irrational reflex of a woman who had lost everything to cruelty once and refused to let it happen again. "He is hurt," she said. "He is not what he was," Rourke finished, and his glance slid past her to the cottage, to the children hiding behind curtains, to the old men who watched from the pub doorway. "He is the vampire king. We do not bargain with monsters." Valen's face did not tighten at the insult. It held instead that look Mara had come to know as exhaustion layered over resignation. He had expected hunters. History had a habit of catching up to him. He did not move to flee. He did not plead for mercy. Instead, he drew himself tall as a reed against a storm. When the first bolt was fired, it missed him by the breadth of a heartbeat. But it struck the carpenter's boy who had dared to stand on the edge of the lane, and the child's scream was a thin, final note that threaded the world with grief. Mara's knees buckled at the sound. The sight of red in the dust was a betrayal she did not have a language for. Around them the village convulsed, the tavern door flung open, curtains trembling, dogs howling. Valen moved then with a speed that made the air cut. The hunters found, too late, that the man at Mara's door was not the slight thing they had imagined. Wings rose like ink unfurling, not feathered but shadow-made, broad and black as the seam between night and oblivion. His mouth opened and fangs glinted, not the pale, theatrical things of children's tailies, but fangs of light, bright as struck metal. He did not roar. He did not kill indiscriminately. He intervened with a precision that made the world narrow to the arc of his hands and the breath of his will. He struck at the nearest of the hunters, and where his palm passed the air shimmered, and the man's blade fell from numb fingers. A hunter lunged with a length of spear and found himself hurled as if by wind into the hedge, limbs tangled with thorns. The order's banner tore where it brushed his wing. The cloth fell away and flapped like a wounded heart. Valen fought as if the world were a chessboard and he had only a few moves left. Mara watched with an ache that was at once terror and a perverse, all-laced wonder. He was savior and monster braided into one, an elegant violence that defended, not with cruelty, but with a grim stewardship. Still, the sight of those wings, of the way his eyes caught the lamplight and threw it back like a blade, made her stomach turn. She saw again the crow in the yard and the quiet shame afterward. She saw his tenderness in healing and the awful necessity of his lethality. The contradiction made her feel dizzy. When the skirmish ended, 2 hunters lay still. The carpenter's boy did not move. Others stammered through curses as they made a shame-filled retreat. Captain Rourke, his face now streaked with the dust of defeat, looked at the cottage as if at something that might still be burning. "You have revealed yourself," he said to Valen, voice raw and small for the first time. "Now there is no shore you can claim you washed up on." They had not come merely to kill. They had come to unmake the possibility of mercy that Valen embodied, and in the process they had made monsters of themselves and left blood in the lane. Mara clutched at a shawl at her throat and felt the wetness beneath her palms, tears, hot and helpless. Valen reached for her, and the touch between them was not gentle. It was the desperate, rehearsed thing of someone trying to gather up all that mattered before it scattered. "We must go," he said. His voice had the urgency of the hunted and none of the haughtiness of a monarch. "There is a place you cannot find on a map. My old court rests beneath the roots of the forest. They will not find you there at once." "Your court," Mara echoed, because the mind balks when confronted with truth too large for the room that held it. "You mean—" "Yes." He looked at the ruin line where the ancient trees jutted like cathedral ribs. "Once a city stood where the forest sleeps. It is mostly dust now, and the keep lies buried in caverns where old servants still wait like statues. It is safer below ground for a time." She hesitated, thinking of the boy in the lane, of the order's iron, of Father Alden's sermon. She thought of the way Hallowmere's faces had changed when the order rode in. Beneath every fold of custom had been the quick, animal fear. She had opened her door to a stranger because she believed shelter was a form of resistance against the small cruelties that ate a life. Now that resistance had become a choice with a higher price. "I will go," she said finally. The choice felt like stepping off a ledge, but she wrapped her hand in his and trusted the pulling line. Around them the village wailed for reasons both righteous and wrong. Beyond the hedgerow the forest waited with patient, root-bound hands. They left at dusk, the pair like a secret threaded through the night. Behind them, Hallowmere shuttered its windows and turned its face to prayer. Ahead of them, under the old oaks and through the bracken, lay the ruins of a realm that remembered his name in the hush of stone. Valen walked with the practiced gait of a man going home to a ruined throne, head bowed not with shame, but with the knowledge that his refuge would ask things of both of them that neither yet understood. The underground halls smelled of dust and old incense, a loneliness preserved like a slow perfume. Roots threaded the vaulted ceilings, damp light pooled where the earth above let itself be thin. Valen moved through those passages with the ease of a man who had memorized every notch and seam of his own undoing. Torchlight caught the high arches and painted long, patient shadows along the stone, and Mara followed with a mixture of awe and an ache that tasted like memory. When the cavern opened into the ruined Great Hall, the effect was of a country waking from a long fever. Pillars rose like the ribs of a sleeping beast, and frescoes bloomed along the walls. Scenes of harvests, of bridges spanning rivers that did not exist in Hallowmere, of figures clasping hands across a table to seal a covenant. At the far end, where a throne had once been set upon a dais, the mural was a swirl of faces, humans and creatures, winged shapes cupped by gentle hands, an image so intent on peace it looked almost naive. Mara's fingers brushed the plaster and left a faint print on centuries of dust. She had read about compassion and law in books, lessons told as if compassion were a commodity to be allocated. Here it was rendered in pigment and stone, a king kneeling before a widow to receive the bread she offered, a council of mortals and immortals clasping forearms in oath. The artistry made her throat tighten. "This is what you wanted," she said quietly, turning to the man whose silence had begun to tell its own story. Valen stood with the torch at his side, face partly hidden in that gray light. "We tried," he said simply. "We thought guardianship did not demand dominion, that balance could be sustained without oppression." He walked over to the mural, and his fingers traced the painted line of his own face long ago, strong jaw, a brow furrowed not with cruelty but with care. "The law bound us to shepherd the thin places," he added. "But law without humility becomes a scaffold for tyranny." Mara studied him. The way his palms had calluses where he had once held scrolls, the way his shoulders carried a tiredness that came from bearing other people's debts. She felt something like reverence for the man who had tried to change a pattern older than the stones. "So they turned on you because you would not harden?" she asked. "They feared softness," Valen admitted. "They feared what mercy might redistribute, land, lineage, power. In the end, the ones who wanted to preserve the old order painted me as a threat." He stepped away from the mural, and the torchlight seemed to follow him like a reluctant witness. "They offered the court a choice: enforce the binding in a new, harsher way or be cast out. I refused. I could not betray my own hand." The confession settled between them as if it needed no argument. Mara thought of the Order of the Crimson Dawn and the boy who had died in the lane. She thought of how fear could make even small people into partisans. "You paid for mercy with exile," she said, and the sentence was not judgmental. It was merely a map of consequence. Valen's face was a study in old grief. He sat upon the dais where the throne had been, and the action had an unpretentious sorrow, like a man sitting on his own empty shoes. "There was also a prophecy," he said after a long while. "It was carved into the east wall near the tollstone, but the language changes if you read it in anger. In the calm reading it says, 'When the last light shelters the last king, his heart shall awaken, and the curse will break.'" He let the words fall like stones into the pool of air. Mara felt the phrase like a hand laid across her sternum. The idea, ridiculous and intimate, bristled with possibility. "Last light," she echoed. "How could I be a light?" "You are not the first to doubt the language of prophecy," Valen said with a rueful half-smile. "Often the words are metaphors and riddles, but some prophecies are literal enough to wound, and this one was written in an age when the thin places were louder. The last light was meant to mean a final human guardian, someone who would choose mercy over fear at a cost." He paused, and the torch snapped, sending a gust of orange across a painted harvest scene. "When I read the fragments after I was cast out, there was an addendum, scribbled by a hand that trembled, suggesting that the sheltering had to be willing. It is not enough to be saved unwillingly. Love cannot be coerced." The cave's hush made the confession luminous. Mara sat on the cold stone opposite him, and she thought of every small mercy she had given her life. A loaf folded in two for a child, an extra stitch in the hem of a widow's apron, the seasons she had endured alone. Could such modest kindness be the fulcrum of an old, turgid spell? It seemed absurd and beautiful all at once. "Do you think I am that light?" she asked, partly because the question was a childish need to know, and partly because, privately, there had been a late-night yearning when her hand lay over his chest and warmth answered where there had been hollowness. "If I am, who am I to make such a bargain?" Valen's silver eyes captured the torchlight and held it like a lantern. He rose and, for once, approached her without the distance he usually kept. He sat beside her on the dais, and the closeness felt less like an assumption and more like a treaty signed in small acts. "You are what you are," he said softly. "A woman who scoops broth into a bowl without asking whether the receiver is deserving. A woman who risks herself for another's pain. That is the kind of light the prophecy speaks of, ordinary and stubborn." They talked then, not of politics or crowns, but of small things that stitched two lives. The taste of nettle soup in spring, the name of a favored childhood rhyme, the ache that comes from watching someone die slowly. He told her of the court's rituals, the tolls paid in the hush between breaths, the oaths taken beneath the weeping ash. She told him of Hallowmere's market days and the way children chased the sparrows. The simplest acts made them less like relic and more like people finding each other at a crossroad. When their conversation dwindled to comfortable pause, Valen reached for her hand. The contact was not theatrical. It held the muted weight of a man testing whether the world could be different. Mara placed her other hand over his and felt, faint and surprising, the echo of a heartbeat that seemed not wholly her own. The sensation unfurled like a tentative sunrise, small, then surer, a stitch mending an old seam. "I must warn you," Valen said after a slow, careful breath. "If I take human blood willingly, if I drink from you to stave off the hunger, I risk losing myself. The more I feed from the living without right, the more the hollow fills with a thing that is not me. It is not a slow erosion. It is a surrender that leaves nothing in my chest but appetite." Mara's thumb left a gentle circle on his hand. "And if you never feed?" she asked. "Then I lie in half-life," he said, with a sad humor that did not mask the truth. "I grow brittle. I watch gardens rot and cannot tend them. I run on restraint and memory. It is a small death of its own." They sat beneath the vaulted stones until the torch burned low. Above, the earth held the night, and the moon took its place in the sky like a sentinel. When they climbed the narrow stair to the surface, stars lay eclipsed, small crescents where the canopy had not yet learned to be empty. They stood for a long while on the ruined battlements, shoulder to shoulder, and watched the stitched horizon where the night met the first threads of dawn. Valen's voice was a whisper that belonged more to confession than to command. "If the prophecy names you and you shelter me willingly, then the old law may break. But prophecies are not maps, they are mirrors. They show us possibility, not absolution. For the curse to end, both must choose." Mara felt the truth thread through her ribs like a bright needle. In the hush before day, they shared a tender confession, not vows forged in crowns, but promises the two of them could keep. To stay with the parts of each other that were fragile, to hold light where darkness had been the only instructor. The promise was small and humane, and in it lay the scaffolding of a future neither had expected. They kissed then, not with fever or haste, but with the long, slow gratitude of two people who had found shelter in a ruined throne. Above them, eclipsed stars watched like old gods who had grown fond of human persistence. They had thought themselves hidden beneath roots and stone, but stone remembers, and roots gossip to the wind. The Order of the Crimson Dawn arrived at the ruined keep before the moon had finished its arc, boots ringing like a litany on the narrow stair. Captain Rourke led them, his face a mask carved from duty and anger. Behind him, the hunters carried their implements, pikes bright with old silver, nets studded with iron teeth, flasks of something that steamed and smelled faintly of ash. Lantern light cut the dark as if trying to sever it, and the air smelled of sweat and prayer and sharpened iron. Valen had expected them to come. Exile had taught him to listen for the footsteps that history made. Mara, however, had not lived long enough to make a habit of predicting a past that chased them like hounds. She woke to the scrape of metal sliding across stone and the hush of men who thought themselves righteous. Her first impression was of an entire world condensed into a single breath. The smell of the earth, the clatter of armor, the sharp voice of Captain Rourke summoning names and charges that were older than any of them wanted to admit. "You cannot stay," Rourke called, and his voice echoed as if the stone itself were complicit. "Surrender him, and perhaps your town will not be made a pyre." Valen stepped from shadow into torchlight. Where he had been a man wrapped in threads of humility, he now stood unbound. Wings folded like a cloak at his back, the burnished planes of his face set in a decision that made the world hold its breath. The hunters pressed forward like a tide with an edge. In the hush before violence, Mara thought of all the small mercies that had led them here. Her open door, the bowl of broth, the hand that had lingered over a heart-shaped hollow, and felt the sheer weight of consequence. The first move came like a bell. A hunter lunged with a spear tipped in blessed silver. Valen moved with a speed that made breath a trailing thing, and the spear shattered where his skin had brushed it, the point fusing into harmless dust. The clash that followed was not a gladiator's show, but a choreography of necessity. Valen defending, protecting, using the old law's craft not to slaughter but to incapacitate. He struck with the flat of his hand, and the air answered in gusts that hurled attackers into spirals of thorned roots. Where hunters advanced, the stone itself answered with minor avalanches. A column toppled, a flight of steps crumbled, and the caverns echoed with the sounds of things that had been asleep for centuries waking. Mara watched from the threshold of the hall, heart an animal trying to find the shape of its cage. Men she had once nodded to in the market lay on the floor, stunned or bleeding. The carpenter's boy who had died in the lane in a different skirmish earlier, this season appeared in her memory like a wound that would not scab. She wanted to run into the fray, to fling herself between Valen and the hunters, but there was a wisdom in staying. Some fights needed not more bodies but steadier breaths. Captain Rourke advanced at last, and when he did the air changed. He was not a man without fear. No hunter could be so foolish. What steadied him was a conviction as honed as the spear he carried. "Valen Drace," he intoned, as if naming could turn the cave into a tribunal. "You are under judgment for the crimes against men and for the tear you have made between the worlds. This court will reclaim you." Valen's laugh was a short thing, not cruel, only tired. "Judgment has a taste," he said, voice sliding like oil across stone. "You are young enough to believe in the absolutes of law." Rourke's face tightened. He produced, with the ceremony of a man who had rehearsed his righteousness, a scroll sealed with red wax. "There are truths you have not been allowed," he said. He read, and the words were the sort that unspooled the years into meaning. That their order had found the old account books of the court and the codices of oath, that there existed a clause written in a hand that trembled and inked with despair. "It says," he continued, "that the curse binding the vampire king can be ended only at a cost, blood willingly given by one who loves. It is not a mere ending. It is balance. The one who loves must offer themselves so the king might be redeemed. Without such an act, the thin places will tear and our world with them." Silence answered like a cold draft. Valen's shoulders drew in as if the world had tilted beneath his feet. For a heartbeat, he seemed to collapse inward, not from fear of steel, but at the sight of possibility braided with doom. Mara felt the sentence like an accusation and a command both. The logic of it was old and terrible. That restoration must be purchased in the currency of ultimate sacrifice. "You ask love to murder itself," Valen said, voice cracking on the edge of disbelief. "You ask the innocent to drown so the guilty may breathe." Rourke's eyes were a pair of flint. "It is not murder if the deed is given. The law requires will. It cannot be coerced." He addressed the hall, not only Valen. "If such a bargain is refused, the curse endures and both kinds will continue to bleed. It is for the greater preservation." Mara's world narrowed to the sound of her own breathing. Memory unspooled like a silver thread. Her mother's hands, her brother's laughter, the seam of loss that had made her cautious and braver by necessity. Her own foolish, human compassion struck her then as both the simplest thing she had left and the heaviest coin she could spend. Valen's eyes found hers, and in them she read the shape of someone who had given up crowns for scraps of mercy, and now stood on a cliff edge where history made terrible demands. "No," she said before she had quite decided to claim the word. The syllable felt both small and definitive. Captain Rourke's mouth hardened. "You cannot be serious. If the prophecy speaks, and if it requires a willing heart," Mara went on, as if reciting a prayer she had learned by instinct rather than study, "then there is someone who loves him. I shelter him. Her voice shook like a reed. "I will give it." There was a pause so complete the drips of water from the stalactites sounded like a metronome. The hunters' faces became a map of disbelief and sudden, scarlet-tinged calculation. Rourke's jaw moved as if a command had been wrenched from his throat. Hallowmere had taught Mara the shape of small sacrifices. No one had taught her how to place herself at the fulcrum of cosmic law. Valen staggered as if struck. His hands went to her shoulders, palms pressing as though to anchor himself in the world that could still be warm. "No," he said with the desperation of a man who knew the depth of what such a loss would be. "I will not ask you. I will not be the cause." "You will not ask me," she repeated, eyes hard as chipped flint now with the steady fire of a woman who had been forged in losses. "But I choose." There was no need for a formal ceremony. Perhaps the law required words. Perhaps it only required the simple, unarguable fact of will. Mara laid her hands on Valen's face. They were small against his ruggedness, but steady. "I love you," she whispered, and the two words were an offering laid on an ancient altar. They were not a storm of passion, but the deepest, quietest kind of devotion, proof that love could be a tether as much as a blade. Valen closed his eyes, and the muscles in his jaw worked as if holding back a sound that would shatter stone. Tears broke, sudden and real, down his face, dark on the pallor of his skin, and he rested his forehead against hers as if to memorize the warmth one last time. "No," he breathed. "You will not give me this. I would rather burn alone than keep you to light my end." Mara smiled despite everything. "Then burn with me," she said. "Burn because you chose a different kind of life. Burn because you once kept mercy. Burn because the world will be kinder if you do. But know this, I will not be a cinder who was unwilling." She kissed him then, slow and steady, and every thought in the cave narrowed to that small, human contract. The hunters watched as if they were attending a rite unfamiliar to them. Captain Rourke stepped forward with the recounting of the law, his conviction like a hammer. "If the act is to be done, it must be witnessed," he intoned. "Do it quickly. We will leave after the balance is restored." Valen cradled her with the tenderness of a man used to ceremonial grief. She was certain for a second that he might refuse, that he might gather her and run into the caverns where the roots lay thick and the stones swallowed sound. But he did not. Instead he knelt, the action more a surrender than a posture, and cupped her throat with hands that trembled. "You know what this means," he whispered. "You will not walk back into the sun." "I know," she said. Her voice was steady with a peace that startled even her. "I did not come to bargain with fate. I only came to love." He drank then, not like the predatory images carved into storybooks, but like a man partaking of sacrament. His lips brushed the pulse at her throat, and the first taste made him catch his breath. It was not the violence of hunger, but the sweetness of a life lived in small increments. Nettles, barley, laughter, the grit of sewing needles, the texture of sunlight against a cheek. He closed his eyes, and the world shifted as if some great clock had been wound and set to run again. For a moment there was silence, an impossible stillness in which every atom seemed to listen. Mara's fingers, damp with the will of her blood, threaded into his hair. She watched him as he drank, and rather than seeing monsters, she saw the unvarnished truth of a man who had been made to stand against storms. "Remember the good," she murmured. "Remember why you were gentle." Valen's answer was a strangled sound, half prayer, half name. The first wave of power that followed the intake was like an ocean breaking. Light, cold, incandescent, flared beneath the vaulted arches. The hunters staggered back, hands raised not with hatred now, but with the stunned humility of those who have glimpsed a god. The caverns hummed with the sound of an old law resisting, and then, painfully, succumbing. He drank again, and with each sip the world brightened. Colors deepened, stone veins flushed with ochre, paints on murals blooming as if they had drunk water after drought. The wings at Valen's back unfolded and turned translucent, sunlight leaking through them as if dawn itself had bled into the caverns. There was a terrible grandeur to it. The curse that had hollowed his chest flared like an umbral sun and then cracked. With a sound like 100 bells, something within him, ancient and malign and tethered to the hunger, shuddered and broke. Mara's breath came in small, fluttering gasps. Her skin paled and then took a quick, winter-like sheen. The life that had lived in her began to pull back like a tide leaving the shore. Valen held her, hands trembling as if holding a sky. He felt, with a clarity sharpened to the edge of pain, the old architecture of the curse loosening. The way's hunger had been bound to his rule, the bargains unmade, the debts finally tallied. He felt grief and release braided together and knew the cost had been paid. "Stay," he begged, voice a low, impossible thing that argued with law and fate. "Please stay." Mara smiled then, a thing both gentle and broken. "You taught me to see the dawn," she whispered. "Now teach it to others." Her fingers found his cheek and the contact was a benediction. "Remember me in the light." Her eyes closed. She drew a last, shallow breath, and the world held that small sound like a secret. Then she went still, a blossom folded against the cold of dawn while the caverns around them exhaled. Valen's cry was not a howl of triumph, but a sound of a man ripped open by love and loss. He pressed his face to her hair and wept, not only for the woman he had lost, but for the burden that had been lifted in a way neither of them had wanted. Light rose like a tide through the caverns, pouring through cracks and seams, painting the frescoes whole and bright. Where there had been ash and gray, gardens reseamed themselves in the painted walls. The fresco of a king kneeling before a widow seemed to bloom with new life. Outside, the first rim of dawn brushed the forest ridgeline. Sunlight, hesitant and curious, peeked through the roots and found the ruined keep. It was a small, defiant thing, a note of proof that the world continued despite the price paid. The hunters staggered into the new light like men who had watched a play in which the finale had been changed without their consent. Captain Rourke looked at Valen, at the dead woman in his arms, and his face contorted in a grief that had no easy absolution. Valen rose, Mara cradled against his chest like a secret he would never forget. The curse had been broken, but where there had been a hollow now, there was a complicated, human ache that would not be easily soothed. His wings drooped, no longer the weapons of a king's dominion, but the tired appendages of a creature who had learned to be mortal again. He stepped into the light with a weight that no crown could equal, the weight of memory and debt, and a love that had burned itself into the marrow. Behind him, the ruined hall held the echo of a sacrifice, and overhead the blood eclipse finished its arc as dawn unfurled. The kingdom under the earth had been given a first, reluctant sunrise. The world, fragile and renewed, turned. Dawn arrived like an answering bell, slow, inevitable, and strangely gentle after the cacophony of the night. Where torches had thrown orange tongues against stone, pale fingers of sun crept and pried, seeking the hollows the dark had kept. The hunters who had stormed the caverns staggered back into that new light as if each ray burned them. Metal in their hands hissed and warped. The blessed silver of their tips ran like quick molten tears and beaded into useless drops on the flagstones. Faces that had been hard with conviction a few hours before now twisted with an animal panic. Captain Rourke bared his teeth at the sight, as if at some moral betrayal of the world he thought he knew. They fled then, not with the order of disciplined men, but with the unraveling of people who had been shown a truth that did not fit their storybooks. Some fell to their knees and prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness. Others threw their banners into the mud and ran toward whatever village gate might still open. Behind them, the caverns hummed with the new quiet left by a sacrifice, the kind of silence that is full of small sounds, the drip of water, the settling of dust, the faint creak of old roots relieved to have held their secret. Valen stood by the dais where sunlight pooled like warm oil, and for the first time since the boy who had once sat in his lap learned to speak, he felt a world shift in him that had nothing to do with power. He cradled Mara in his arms, her body small and still against the fabric of his coat. He walked with the slow deliberation of someone who had been given a relic too tender to mishandle. Each step echoed. Each echo seemed to carry back a memory, a laugh from a market, a lullaby hummed in a kitchen, the click of a seamstress needle. He carried her not like a king bearing spoils, but like a man bringing home the last thing he loved. At the altar, beneath the fresco that had once promised peace and now shone newly vivid in morning light, Valen set Mara down with a tremor in his hands. The stone was cool and smelled faintly of rosemary and smoke. He knelt before her and laid his forehead against her clasped hands, feeling the chill of what mortal life left behind. He wept openly, Sobs that were not theatrical but raw, the release of a heart that had been closed for centuries and now cracked under the pressure of unbearable love and unbearable loss. For a long, suspended time he did not move, but let the grief do what grief must, unmake him into a person who could, perhaps, be remade. Then, as though led by a thread he had not known he was following, he rose and pressed his palm to Mara's breast. He expected emptiness, because her breath had ceased. Instead, there was something like a tremor beneath his hand. Not the steady warmth of life returned, but a small, living ember, a pulse that answered him in a way that was not wholly outside himself. He drew back, startled, and for a wild, impossible second feared trickery. The memory of her blood, the sacrament that had undone his curse, had not vanished. It had braided itself into his veins. He felt her there in a way that was neither spirit nor mere memory, but a new kind of presence, an echo woven into the marrow of his being. When he closed his eyes, he saw her face in the places she had occupied in life, at the table, above the hearth, leaning against him as if the world were a season and they had both come to rest in the same one. The court, which had once been empty but for the murals and the patience of stone, began to answer to that presence. Where the painted gardens had been dry and faded, a green breathed through cracked plaster. Tiny seedlings pushed up between flagstones and uncurled like hesitant hope. Vines threaded the columns as if the earth remembered the promise of tending. A scent, damp soil warmed by sun, rose that had not been there before, a perfume of reclamation. Valen walked the halls and found that with each step small miracles unfolded. The rusted basin in the servant's wing shed its orange with a soft scrape and revealed a sheen of key-bright metal. The fresco of the harvest, browned and scabbed for years, bloomed with color until it looked not painted but living. It was as if Mara's vow, given in blood and love, had left its footprint not only in his chest, but across the bones of the place that had once been his kingdom. The dead, in the sense of things that had been abandoned, were being coaxed into a quiet revival. Sitting at the top of the steps, where light pooled like a blessing, Valen lifted Mara's hand to his lips. He spoke aloud, not with the measured inflections of a king addressing a court, but with the simple, human cadence of a mourner naming what he had lost. "You have taught me the language of dawn," he said. "You have made me feel a thing I had kept like a contraband, to care without tallying profit." He rose and paced the hall like a man taking stock, and in the rhythm of his feet were the beginnings of a vow. He would not be the ruler who commanded with fear again. Mercy, which had been a crime in the eyes of those who toppled him, would be the architecture of any future he permitted. He would not rebuild a court of grooved power where appetites could be sated at the expense of others. The balance that his people had once kept, stewardship of the thin places, reverence for death's dignity, would be restored not as dominion, but as guardianship with humility. Valen took up a small object from the altar, a ribbon Mara had worn in her hair, a scrap of cloth still smelling faintly of her. He wrapped it about his wrist like a pledge. "For as long as I walk this soil," he promised the empty air and the vivid murals that now bore witness, "I will protect what she loved. I will walk under the sun and teach those who persist in fear that mercy is not weakness. I will make a place where the living and the keeping can stand without hunger ruling the exchange." It was not a vow to abolish pain or to make the world neat. It was an admission that he had learned new stakes for power. Not how wide one could spread their shadow, but how gently one could tend the light in another's hand. The change would not come overnight. Old habits and old fears did not die because a few stones had been coaxed into bloom. But the first, necessary step toward healing had been taken. A sacrifice had been made willingly, and in doing so, had altered the ledger of fate. Word would travel. Rumors would be rewritten by those who had survived the night. Some would call him monster still. Others might call him king. But Valen, reborn into the clarity of a heart that now beat with memories not entirely his own, knew the truth of names mattered less than the work that followed. He would be the guardian the thin places needed, not by decree but by daily, grueling choice. He arranged a place for Mara near the altar, not to entomb her but to remember. He set a bowl of barley and a cup of water beside a little sprig of rosemary. Then, in the hush of the ruined great hall that had become a garden of small beginnings, he sat and wept again, this time with the slow resolve of someone who meant to move forward carrying loss like a map, not a chain. Outside, the sun rose properly, no longer blood-tinted but clear and honest, and its light poured into the caverns, into Hallowmere and beyond. Where there had been fear, there was now a fragile, trembling possibility. The king who wept would not tighten his hold on the world. He would, from the soft center of his new pain, teach what Mara's choice had cost and what it had bought. That love could unmake a curse, and that mercy, tried, costly, human, could root even in ruined stone. Time, which in the halls of men is counted in births and graves, moved differently beneath the roots of Valen's reclaimed court. Seasons threaded themselves through the stone like careful fingers mending a torn garment. Where once frescoes had been mute, their colors deepened until bolder narratives could be read by those whose eyes had patience. Travelers told new tales at market stalls, of a ruined keep that bloomed at sunrise, of a pale king who walked beneath the sun without his cloak of night. Hallowmere, which had once shut its door and turned its face from what it did not understand, began, slowly and in whispers, to fold the story of that night into its chorus of legends. Valen kept the ribbon Mara had tied about his wrist. He kept the bowl of barley she had once eaten from, set now on a small stone ledge beside the altar. He tended the hall as if it were a garden that required hands guided by memory and grief. He taught those who came, a ragged few at first, then a cautious collection of patients and pilgrims, what stewardship meant. How to tend a thin place without taking more than necessary. How to bind the dead with rites that honored rather than enslaved. How to resist the temptation to make permanence from fear. He walked the borderlands where the forest met the village and spoke sometimes to the children who dared to follow him. They were not taught to worship him, but to know that monsters could be taught new names. Yet no painted wall, no new law, no careful stewardship could fill the hollow left by Mara. The mornings he woke to the first keen of light were still edged with the memory of the taste of her blood on his tongue and the hollow ache of a hand that no longer played with his hair. Sometimes, in the lull between tasks, he would sit at the altar and talk aloud to the woman he had loved, an odd habit of those who have had to turn the living into liturgy. He told her small things, the silly and the grave, how the ivy had found its way into the servant's wing, how a child in Hallowmere had learned to read a page of an old hymn, how the hunter's order dwindled into something more cautious when they learned to recognize the difference between predator and guardian. Years softened him, but did not erase him. The hollow in his chest did not close like a wound stitched. It became a room with windows he sometimes opened. Once, months after the sacrifice, he had felt a warmth beneath his ribs that was not memory alone, a beat like a shy animal testing the air. The sensation had returned with more certainty over seasons. A pulse that hesitated and then answered to the cadence of birdsong, a rhythm that did not belong wholly to him, and yet gave him the knowledge that what had been broken was not beyond mending. In the quiet of that dawning, his tears were not only for loss, but for a slow, improbable repair. Word of the king who walked in daylight seeded itself into places Valen had never thought to revisit. Into villages the road had once bypassed, into taverns where old mariners traded far-flung rumors for ale, into the dreams of women who had never heard of him, but who woke in the soft hours with the taste of wood smoke and a name on their lips. Stories travel by appetite. Some were given shape by poets who liked the curve of romance, others by the practical hands of storytellers who prefer their facts salted with wonder. It was in one such village, a cluster of cottages nested along a stream and bright with laundry on lines, that a new story began to gather its first breath. She was called Lira Asterisk, and the village midwife knew her as someone who sang to seedlings and spoke of weather as if it were a person she owed favors to. Lyra's eyes were green as forest dew, clear, small pools that gathered light, and when she laughed the villagers thought of spring. She had a habit of waking at odd hours, sitting by the window and staring not at what lay in the street, but at horizons only she could read. Lira dreamed, and her dreams were the sort that tug the edges of reality loose. Night after night, she found herself in a hall of stone where murals shifted and looked back at her like animals come to life. A man with silver eyes would call her my dawn, and in the dream, he was always both beautiful and old as weather. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the sense that a hand she had not held in this life had brushed her hair. Dreams are not proof. They are invitations, soft and insistent. Lira began to hum a tune she had never learned and to make small offerings at the edge of the wood. Loaves, bundles of nettles, a ribbon tied to a root. The villagers found it quaint and called it superstition. Lira kept doing it because ancient will has a persistence that ordinary logic cannot always tame. Valen heard the rumors in the way that men of habit do, through travelers at the gate, through the boys who came to sweep and never stayed, through the slow drip of news that reached even the forgotten places. He did not go to find her at first. The hall had taught him restraint and the long art of waiting. When he did decide to watch, he kept to the tree line like someone who understood the etiquette of surprises. There, under the lean of alder and ash, he observed a woman who moved through the morning like someone who had been shaped by small mercies. The first time their eyes met, it was not a grand collision. He had the inclination to think he would mistake her for another memory. People sometimes echo those we mourn. But Lyra's gaze held something newer. A recognition that did not wear the weight of history like a cloak, but wore, instead, the quiet claim of a soul finding a place it had once known. She paused in her ribbon tying when she saw him, and did not flee. For a breath, the two regarded each other in the language of things that had been tested and found tender. Valen stepped from the tree line slow, as one who has relearned how to walk on mercy. The ribbon about his wrist caught the light. His face had the map lines of grief softened by the discipline of wanting to do better. He did not demand love as recompense. He approached like a pilgrim approaching an altar, respectful, wary, and filled with a kind of hungry hope that had grown quieter with years. "You sheltered a beggar once, my love," he murmured when they were close enough that their breaths braided, and the sentence held the shape of the thing he had to say and could not say all at once. "And gave a king his soul." Lyra's smile was small and not without the shadow of tears. She did not laugh as if the words were a joke, nor did she tremble as if they were too much. Instead, she reached for his hand, and where skin met skin, there was a flicker, a small, familiar warmth that ran through him like a remembered hymn. He felt his chest answer the touch in a way he had not been able to for so long that the movement of his pulse seemed like a revelation. "My Dawn," she said then, soft as the name had been in her dreams. The words fit into the hollows between them like bridges. They did not rush. Valen had learned that the truest remakings occurred in quiet increments, in the planting of seeds and the watching of sprouts. He showed Lira the hall and the garden that now bore herbs for healing rather than altars for hunger. He taught her the old rites, not to bind but to free, and she taught him the domestic magic of making bread and listening to the town. In small acts, they built a life that was a tender kind of governance. Rules of consent, daily charity, and a shared commitment to preserve the thin places without allowing them to rule the living. When the screen of their story lingered on them, the man who had once been thought a night terror and the woman who dreamed of halls, dawn was breaking like proof. Daylight pooled and spilled across the hills, and for once the contrast between night and day felt less like opposition and more like a meeting. Valen stood with Lira at his side, his hand warm in hers, and felt a heart that beat not because law demanded it, but because love, slow and deliberate, had taught it the measure of what matters. As the camera would linger, the final line he whispered, meant for no one but the wind and her ears, was a benediction and a vow rolled into one. "You sheltered a beggar once, my love, and gave a king his soul." The dawn widened, and the world, bruised and mended, turned toward it.